What's up, guys? It is Tuesday, April 13th, and today we're going to look at the last chapter of our story, The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft, and we're going to get ready for a quiz. Like I said, we're going to have a little quiz over the story. It's not a huge grade, but it's going to be our first assessment grade of the quarter, because I want to start having assessment grades in there instead of doing it at the end and making a huge difference where you don't really know what that category is going to be filled with until it's too late. So I'm going to open up the doc, and chapter 5 is page 37. As you can see, it's near the end. It's almost like a little epilogue. This is also, I wanted to mention, if you haven't read the whole thing and you want to get caught up, there's this audiobook I linked to that is pretty well done. You've got a couple different narrators performing different voices and so on, and it actually takes longer than just reading it, so it won't save you time, but it will be a nice change of pace if you read some and you want to listen to some. It does have the chapters marked, so you can like jump to a specific part, and it's a nice alternative, especially if maybe you're trying to do multiple all at once. Maybe you read chapter 3 and then listen to chapter 4 or something like that. So check it out. And there are others on YouTube, but that's the best one that I found. Now, after that, I'm going to give you guys a little study guide, I guess you call it. Unfortunately, I was out yesterday. I got my vaccine, my second round of the vaccine on the weekend, and people had warned me that that second shot has some worse side effects and takes longer to recover from, and that's definitely true. I was not at school yesterday, and I was just really feeling terrible. Still am kind of, but I didn't make a study guide. I feel bad because I didn't quite feel up to it. So I'm going to give you a Quizlet that was made by somebody else, but it's got 30 questions. They're all pretty good, and we're going to use that as our study guide instead of a homemade thing from me. However, when I give you the real quiz, I'll change it a little bit just to kind of match with this, just so you don't feel like it was asking you about stuff that isn't really on there. So I'll adjust my thing to make sure that what you covered is not way off. If you want to look at this today or tomorrow, that'll work just great, and I'll link it in the post for today. Anyway, let's look at chapter 5. If you want to jump to it, you can hit like Control F and then type V dot, and that'll bring you to 4, but then you can hit next and go here. So in chapter 4, I read some aloud, but I didn't read the whole thing. It's the longest chapter, I think. In chapter 4, we get to the action. So 3 was all about the backstory, where we heard from the old man what had happened in the past. There was an island who summoned these creatures from the deep and made a deal with them and got some prosperity in return, but they also had to offer sacrifices and join in this ancient cult. That island was wiped out by the normal people around it, and Obed Marsh, the traveler, took some of their artifacts and some of their rituals back to America in the town of Innsmouth, and he summoned these creatures and tried to make a deal with them. At first he got thrown in jail by the normal people around, but then some of the creatures came up and broke him out, and so he kind of made a little home for himself and built up a little following and built up a little cult of his own in the area. Chapter 4, our narrator goes to his hotel room because the way out is broken, quote unquote. They're probably lying about that just to trap him in town. And then there's a big chase. So our guy tries to lock the door. He feels like that's not enough. He hears people banging up the staircase, and he like shoves the bed up against the door and tries to barricade. And then it's one of those great chases through like in a movie, there's always a chase through an apartment or hotel room. I remember this was somehow like in the late 90s and early 2000s, this was a big thing in Enemy of the State or The Matrix or the Bourne movies or any of those type of things. There's always a chase where people are going through different apartments or hotel rooms or something. This is like that, where our guy doesn't go out into the main hall. He goes through these connecting doors that connect one hotel room to another. And so like he goes to one, and then the people start banging on that door, and then he goes to one, and they're kind of following him down. And he eventually hops out a window, jumps on a roof, goes to the main area of the town, and sees what's chasing him. And what's chasing him are people that are not just a little bit different. So far we've seen like the Innsmouth citizens, starting with the bus driver who took him here, are a little bit weird looking. They have like slightly grayish, bluish skin. They have these weird big eyes. And he's thought, oh, that's weird. I wonder if it's a genetic thing, or wonder if it's a disease. How does it work? But they were still like human, and he thought, oh, that's just humans, that something weird has happened to them. But now, when it's at night, and they're all coming out of the basements and so on where they've been hiding, he sees people that are just like fishmen. They're just like either humans that have transformed fully, or maybe they just came out of the sea and they were never really human to begin with. And so there's these fish creatures that are like, big webbed fin-like hands and big eyes and like clear gills instead of just a weird thing on their neck like he mentioned before. He's like, oh yeah, these are definitely gills now, for real. And there have been hints throughout the story that like maybe these things were related to humans if you go back a million years or 100 million years or something. And again, we don't know for sure. Maybe these people that we're seeing now are humans that have transformed fully, or maybe they are creatures from the deep that haven't been related to humans in millennia. But either way, they're coming after him. And they're not speaking English. They're speaking some weird language of their own. And our narrator doesn't really know what the plan is. Are they going to kill him? Are they going to try to, convert him to their form? Are they going to offer him as a sacrifice? We don't know. And it's going to be hard to find out because they're not really in the mood for communication. But our guy escapes, and he hides in a railroad cut. Cut is the word they use for it, like a ditch that has been dug for the railroad to pass through. And so at the end, he's kind of losing his mind. He's like, is this real? Am I going crazy? Is it a dream? Did Zadok exist at all? Did this guy tell me all these true things, or did I just kind of dream it up and I'm losing my mind? But he does hide in this railroad ditch and fall asleep. And so chapter 5 is when he wakes up the next day. And this is really the thing that wraps it all up. Chapter 4 could be the end. If it was just a simple story like, oh, I got chased by these monsters and I ran away, that could be the end. But then it wouldn't have this stuff that really adds the lore and the bigger implications and so on. So let's read. We might read the whole thing because it's very short. We'll see what happens. It was a gentle daylight rain that awakened me from my stupor in the brush-grown railway cut, and when I staggered out to the roadway ahead, I saw no trace of any prints in the fresh mud. The fishy odor, too, was gone. Innsmouth's ruined roofs and toppling steeples loomed up grayly toward the southeast, but not a living creature did I spy in all the desolate salt marshes around. My watch was still going and told me that the hour was past noon. The reality of what I had been through was highly uncertain in my mind, but I felt that something hideous lay in the background. I must get away from evil-shadowed Innsmouth, and accordingly I began to test my cramped, wearied powers of locomotion. Despite weakness, hunger, horror, and bewilderment, I found myself after a long time able to walk, so started slowly along the muddy road to Rowley. Before evening I was in the village, getting a meal and providing myself with presentable clothes. I caught the night train to Arkham, and the next day talked long and earnestly with government officials there, a process I later repeated in Boston. With the main result of these colloquies, the public is now familiar, and I wish, for normality's sake, there were nothing more to tell. Perhaps it is madness that is overtaking me, yet perhaps a greater horror or a greater marvel is reaching out. So now we get back to the beginning. In the beginning of the story, chapter 1, paragraph 1, he mentioned that, hey, I told the government, and the government came in and sort of wiped out some of this stuff. Now we see where that happened. After he ran away, he went to this office, and apparently they believed him, or at least they went to look for themselves. And again, I've mentioned this a few times, but this is really one of these places where you see the similarity to Edgar Allan Poe. If he was writing something like this, it would look about the same. You have two kinds of narrators in Poe. One is the one who sees something crazy and tries to, calm down and say, wait a minute, we're going to be scientific about this. We're going to doubt our senses, and we're going to, really take our time. And then the other kind is the one who's like loving it, is, I'm not crazy, you're crazy, and I'm totally fine. Really falling into the madness. And this, currently the narrator in that mode of like, you know what, maybe I'm okay, maybe I'm going to figure out what's going on, but I'm not going to lose my mind yet. If I had a dream, that's okay, or if I saw something weird, that's okay too. As may well be imagined, I gave up most of the foreplanned features of the rest of my tour, the scenic, architectural, and antiquarian diversions on which I had counted so heavily. Nor did I dare look for that piece of strange jewelry said to be in the Miskatonic University Museum. I did, however, improve my stay in Arkham by collecting some genealogical notes I had long wished to possess. Very rough and hasty data, it is true, but capable of good use later on when I might have time to collate and codify them. The curator of the Historical Society there, Mr. E. Lapham Peabody, was very courteous about assisting me and expressed unusual interest when I told him I was a grandson of Eliza Orne of Arkham, who was born in 1867 and married James Williamson of Ohio at the age of 17. It seemed that a maternal uncle of mine had been there many years before on a quest, much like my own, and that my grandmother's family was a topic of some local curiosity. There had, Mr. Peabody said, been considerable discussion about the marriage of her father, Benjamin Orne, just after the Civil War, since the ancestry of the bride was peculiarly puzzling. That bride was understood to have been an orphan Marsh of New Hampshire, a cousin of the Essex County Marshes, but her education had been in France, and she knew very little of her family. A guardian had deposited funds in a Boston bank to maintain her and her French governess, but that guardian's name was unfamiliar to Arkham people, and in time he dropped out of sight, so that the governess assumed his role by court appointment. The Frenchwoman, now long dead, was very taciturn, and there were those who said she could have told more than she did. But the most baffling thing was the inability of anyone to place the recorded parents of the young woman. Enoch and Lydia Meserve Marsh, that name in parentheses is the maiden name of this person, among the known families of New Hampshire. Possibly, many suggested, she was the natural daughter of some Marsh of prominence. She certainly had the true Marsh eyes. Most of the puzzling was done after her early death, which took place at the birth of my grandmother, her only child. Having formed some disagreeable impressions connected with the name of Marsh, I did not welcome the news that it belonged to my own ancestral tree. Nor was I pleased by Mr. Peabody's suggestion that I had the true Marsh eyes myself. However, I was grateful for data which I knew would prove valuable, and took copious notes and lists of book references regarding the well-documented Orton family. So this is a thing that I don't really get into much. I don't really like to do the thing where we talk about an author's biography and what was going on in real life, and I usually prefer to stick with the fictional universe. But here it does maybe help a little bit. H.P. Lovecraft, in real life, was someone who had a tragic family. His father died when he was young. His father was put in an asylum and didn't live for very long there. And a lot of the records say that he had syphilis. You know, syphilis is an STD, but it gets into the spine and it leads to all sort of brain disease and so on. It so makes people have mental illness and also physical problems, and it can really be something that ruins a person's life in their 40s or 50s or so on. This is probably what happened to Lovecraft's father, even though Lovecraft himself was saying, he had some sort of exhaustion, he had some sort of nervous breakdown, but he never really acknowledged that it was syphilis. Maybe they told him something else when he was a kid. And in general, beyond that, Lovecraft's family had some tragedy. Lovecraft's friends had some tragedy. One of his best friends, Robert E. Howard, who's a guy we might know, a guy who wrote the Conan the Barbarian stories, committed suicide in the 1930s. I think it was a bit after this story, but it was around the time. And so Lovecraft had this sort of, pessimism about his own fate. And, what if this curse is in my blood, or it's in the air around me? And what if my family has passed down some terrible things to me? And of course he talked about, or other people talked about when they met him, that he was, something that we might describe as depressed, or, use other medical terms that didn't exist at the time. Melancholy, they probably would have said. And so it kind of makes sense that if he was going to put that in the fantasy, it would use fantasy terms. It would not just say like, we have a mental illness, but it would be like, oh, what if my family has a touch of this ancient curse from an ancient god in the sea? What if one of my grandmothers was related to these monsters who were summoned by a cult? Maybe that would mean he has something in him that drew him to the city. Maybe that would mean he has something in him. Maybe that's why the fish people were coming after him. Maybe they could sense that he was a distant relation. Maybe they could sense that he was one of the marshes in his blood. And of course the word marsh is a deliberate choice. He's used the word marsh in the story with the lowercase m, just talking about the geography. So it kind of makes sense that, like, if you're connected, if your family is connected, and you're also connected to the land, and you have this like, deep roots in the area, both in a bad way and a good way. I went directly home to Toledo from Boston, and later spent a month at Maumee recuperating from my ordeal. In September, I entered Oberlin for my final year, and from then till next June, I was busy with studies and other wholesome activities, reminded of the bygone terror only by occasional official visits from government men in connection with the campaign which my pleas and evidence had started. Around the middle of July, just a year after the Innsmouth experience, I spent a week with my late mother's family in Cleveland, checking some of my new genealogical data with the various notes, traditions, and bits of heirloom material in existence there, and seeing what kind of connected chart I could construct. I did not exactly relish the task, for the atmosphere of the Williamson home has always depressed me. There was a strain of morbidity there, and my mother had never encouraged my visiting her parents as a child, although she always welcomed her father when he came to Toledo. My Arkham-born grandmother had seemed strange and almost terrifying to me, and I do not think I grieved when she disappeared. I was 8 years old then, and it was said that she had wandered off in grief after the suicide of my Uncle Douglas, her eldest son. He had shot himself after a trip to New England, the same trip, no doubt, which had caused him to be recalled at the Arkham Historical Society. This uncle had resembled her, and I had never liked him either. Something about the staring, unwinking expression of both of them had given me a vague, unaccountable uneasiness. My mother and Uncle Walter had not looked like that. They were like their father, though poor little cousin Lawrence. Walter's son had been an almost perfect duplicate of his grandmother before his condition took him to the permanent seclusion of a sanitarium at Canton. I had not seen him in 4 years, but my uncle once implied that his state, both mental and physical, was very bad. His worry had probably been a major cause of his mother's death 2 years before. So he's getting into the stuff that is a little more real life. You know, this could happen to somebody. We all have incidents in our family tree where somebody had a tragic end, and maybe the people don't talk about them anymore, or maybe they try to avoid the topic. And our narrator has some of that. And our narrator mentions a few things that could be hints at stuff that even he doesn't realize, but we can pick out. So, for example, mention these people have this staring expression. And that would be true in real life. If someone is, really traumatized, they might just kind of have a look. In the veterans of World War I, they called it the 1,000-yard stare. You know, people who would just kind of zone out and think of their horrible memories, but not focus on real life. And yet, because it's this story, because it has the fantasy, we can think of, well, what if they had the fishy eyes? You know, what if they were related to these monsters in a distant way? And what if that stare is not just psychology, but what if it's a little bit of the, evil blood in them? This kind of reminds me of another story I was talking about recently. I think I mentioned to you guys The Fly. There's a movie from 1986 called The Fly. Jeff Goldblum is a scientist who invents a teleporter, and he gets in one pod and then he zaps and appears in the other one, and he's like, wow, this is amazing. I've invented teleportation. I'm going to change the world. But he gets in one and a little fly buzzes in, and so when he comes out at the other end, they're combined. They're like one creature, and he looks normal, but he realizes pretty soon after that he has fly DNA. And at first it's like a superhero movie because he has strength and he can climb on the walls, but then he keeps transforming, and by the end he's this horrible monster that has to be destroyed. Now, that's a nice, fun way of showing something horrible, right? Because if they did a movie about a guy who just physically deteriorates and then has to be killed, that would be unwatchable. It would be just like totally sad and tragic and mean. But if they add this weird fantasy sci-fi element, then it's like, wow, we're watching something cool. So if you just did a story about a family who was just like losing their mind, and some of them committed suicide, and some of them were losing their jobs, and some of them were put in an asylum, it would be terrible. Nobody would want to read it. But if you add in this element of like monsters and strange curses, then it becomes interesting in a new way. My grandfather and his widowed son Walter now comprised the Cleveland household, but the memory of older times hung thickly over it. I still disliked the place and tried to get my researches done as quickly as possible. Williamson records and traditions were supplied in abundance by my grandfather, though for ornament material I had to depend on my Uncle Walter, who put at my disposal the contents of all his files, including notes, letters, cuttings, heirlooms, photographs, and miniatures. Okay, I'm actually going to stop now because this video is getting long and I never want to make one over a certain maximum. So you guys can read the rest. It's only a tiny bit until the end. It's like 2 pages. But you really want to check it out because the very end has a nice little, I don't want to say twist, but it's got a nice little moment at the end where it kind of all comes to mean something new, and you can think about what it all has led to in terms of the story. You can think about what it all has led to in terms of sort of real life metaphorical stuff related to family and mental illness and all of that. And you can just think about how it works for the narrator as a character. We never know the narrator's name, by the way. It doesn't say, it's just I. But at least now we know his last name. So I'm going to stop it here, and I'm going to post this, the audiobook, and the study guide so that we'll wrap it all together. Next time I'm going to post the quiz, but it's not like you have to do it right then. It's going to be one of those where you can take it on your own time, open book, take home, that kind of thing. And I'll degrade it a day or two later. Even if you turn in late, that's fine. So we'll get on it. Thanks.